Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to briefly explain the structure of the webinar. So today, Tom will be talking about practical ways that humanities teachers in secondary schools can support learners who use English as an additional language to ensure that proficiency in English isn't a barrier to enjoying and succeeding in humanities subjects. Tom will be looking at the specific language demands of humanities subjects and opportunities for inclusion and engagement, and how understanding proficiency in English can enable teachers to support the development of both language skills and curriculum knowledge. If there's time at the end, Tom will take any questions that you may have, so please do feel free to type your questions into the chat box as they come to you. And I'll collect them throughout the webinar, and if we've got time, we'll go through those at the end. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tom. So Tom joined the Bell Foundation in 2020. He's worked in language education since 2003 and has taught in China, Japan, Ecuador and North Africa. His main areas of interest are teaching young learners, project-based learning and teacher development. He holds an MA in Anthropological Linguistics and is CELTA and Delta qualified. He has worked as a teacher trainer in the UK and abroad and as a regular speaker at a number of different English language teaching conferences. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see people joining us from so many different places today. And please, as you join us, just say hi in the chat. Let us know where you're from and what you do. It's interesting for me to understand who I'm talking to. So let's begin. And I'll get cracking because we've got a lot to cover. So here are our learning intentions for today. I'll let you read those. And just a quick note on terminology for today. I'm going to use the term plurilingual learners, and by this I'm referring to learners who speak more than one language, so it encompasses bilingual learners and those who speak more than two languages. And in this webinar in particular, it means those for whom English is an additional language. And it's a deliberate choice because I just think it's a more positive way of framing and referring to English language learners, especially compared to terms like learner with EAL, which gets used a lot in the UK and sort of sounds a lot like SEN terminology and can have some negative connotations around it. And in an international context, I think we all understand that language support is not a special or an exceptional educational need. It's a fundamental one. So yeah, plurilingual learner is the term we'll be using today. And we're going to go through a number of different things. We'll start with looking at what I mean by adaptive teaching very briefly. So some educators, perhaps those with less training and experience in working with plurilingual learners, may feel a need to reduce or lower academic expectations. But of course, we all know that teacher expectations can get internalized by learners. So it's important that we have high expectations of them so that they are more likely to strive to meet the challenge. And it's a common misconception that simplifying the curriculum is an appropriate response. But instead, we're going to advocate today for message abundancy and adapting and simplifying the learning process rather than the learning content wherever possible. And the principle is that by hearing the message in different ways with different types and amounts of support, the learners will be able to access the same curriculum. But of course, this leads us to ask the question, is adaptive teaching the same for plurilingual learners as it is for learners who are fully proficient in English, such as those who speak it as a first language? Some people would argue that yes, it is, and in this, and in the case of the following, we can see that there are generic needs of all learners. For example, we need to adapt lesson outcomes and tasks. We use strategies such as scaffolding, modeling, and step learning, etc. for all our learners. And we make sure that work stretches and challenges all learners and enables progress. However, as you can see from these descriptors, they're quite generic and they don't really recognize the very distinctive learning needs of learners whose need is solely language learning. So we can also see that we need to do something different because plurilingual learners have a double job to do. They're learning English, but they're also learning through English at the same time. So in this sense, it's not the same. And so there are other considerations such as, language support will be required for content understanding, teachers needing to modify or grade their language, learners may know, of course, the content already in their home language, but not in English. We will need to adjust content to support language development. Language models are really important, and opportunities to use and manipulate, reinforce and extend language are vital too. And I think one thing that it's important to note is that many of these teaching strategies that we use to support plurilingual learners can be similar to those that are used with learners who are identified with special educational needs too, which in some contexts has led to EAL learners ending up in low ability groups. But it's really important to see that the strategies that we use with plurilingual learners, we use them for very different reasons, so that we avoid that conflation. Okay, now let's look at the distinctive nature of the humanities. Certainly the humanities subjects bring with them, I think, amazing opportunities to learn about people, about our world and our place in it, our interactions with cultures and religions, the marks we've made in the world and the challenges facing us in caring for its future. So whether this is in the context of geography, history, religious studies, sociology. Oh, sorry, my slides have just rushed on ahead for some reason. I'm just going to reverse back. I think my mouse button must have got clicked on. There we go. So we have all these different elements. Oh, what's happening? Is somebody Caroline or someone accidentally pressing a button here because my slides are changing and I can't do anything to stop them.
No, I'm not touching anything.
How strange. Sorry. Stop. Hold on a moment. Tech issues. What's going on here? Wow. Hold on one moment. I'm just going to check there's nothing. Perhaps my keyboard's malfunctioning. Okay. I think we're all right. Apologies for this. Oh no. Oh, goodness me.
Maybe move over this slide quite quickly then.
Yeah, well, this is not really the key.
No.
It's not just this slide, it's the whole presentation. That's the trouble.
Is it? Okay.
So, hold on. It's just clicking through the whole presentation as if somebody's holding their finger on the forward button. Apologies for this, everybody.
Has it stopped?
Well, it seems to be stopping and then starting again. Okay.
You'll all be glad to hear that we're that's it. Well,
I've never experienced this problem before, so it's always throw something new at you. Anyway, I think we're good. As I was mentioning, humanities, so many opportunities, I think, for developing both language and content knowledge. And at the heart of the humanities is language, as we can see in this diagram. For example, studying a geography topic, learners have to learn factual knowledge, conceptual understanding, collaborative planning, application of knowledge and understanding to evaluate issues. And of course, at the heart of it all is the language. It requires competent and fluent command of language to achieve all these things. So I think we can also look at the demands of humanities exams and assessments, which also point us to the importance of language. As we can see here are some examples of extracts from exam papers or exam questions or essay questions. Humanities topics tend to involve lengthy responses or essay questions. We have, in the case of the IB, for example, you have essays and mini theses are used for assessment in IGCSE and subjects such in the subjects there tends to be exam assessed, but they all have very strong language demands. So a strong passive grasp of language is required to access humanities subjects, which are undeniably language heavy. So teachers are experts in assessing learners, but we're going to have a quick look at a different type of assessment because we need to differentiate when we're working with plurilingual learners between what are their learning needs and what are their language needs. So for some plurilingual learners, especially those at the early stages of learning a new language, a humanities topic will be particularly challenging because as well as the potential lack of cultural experience related to some topics, such as religious festivals or historical events or so on, we also need to distinguish between the language and learning needs to ensure the student gets the support they need. Understanding our learners' proficiency in English is one aspect of this. Some of you may already be aware of the EAL Assessment Framework for Schools from the Bell Foundation to inform you of a learner's proficiency in English. You may be using a different framework, but the key message is that support is required at every level, and the level of support that is generally required between proficiency bands varies. So a learner who is new to English is going to have very different needs to a learner who is already at band C, is developing confidence. I think it's also important to note that at the higher levels, at band E, even with fluent learners, no EAL support doesn't mean that no language support is required. It just means that those learners only require the age-appropriate literacy support that proficient English learners would also get as well. And if you're interested, accompanying this framework is a document on classroom strategies for each of the proficiency bands as well. You can go on our website and find that. As well as knowing their proficiency in English, it's also really important to understand their proficiency in first languages. So as you know, children arriving in secondary school will have had different experiences of education. Some may not have experienced English medium education before. And knowing the languages a child can speak and the extent of their literacy in those languages will point you towards the right support strategies to make the best use of their linguistic knowledge. Okay, moving swiftly on, let's think about the sort of teaching process now in more depth, and we'll start with lesson planning. So it's important to recognize, I think, with adaptive teaching that it's less likely to be useful if the class teacher has to constantly create different tasks for different groups of pupils. Okay, just from a purely pragmatic point of view, it's just not realistic, and we shouldn't be creating tasks for the sake of taking tasks. I think a better approach is to think about the strategy we use in terms of the intended learning, and the book I would point you towards, I'm taking some of the points here from, is Jean Conte's book, who's a retired lecturer in education at the University of Leeds, and she asks that teachers in their planning consider what we want learners to do with the language, what kinds of language they're going to need to do these things, and most importantly, she advocates that rather than being a bolt-on, meeting the needs of plurilingual learners needs to be integrated into the lesson planning. So knowing the language demands of the curriculum area and planning on how to support the learners in meeting the demands is going to increase access to learning, and this needs to happen in the planning process, not just sort of added on at the end. So helpful approach then, I think, is to ensure that language is at the core of lesson planning, and an integrated approach where we are expecting learners to do with language and the kinds of language they will need in order to do the intended task should be included at the planning stage. So we need to understand the language demands for each teaching context, and that needs to be embedded as part of the planning, and we're going to explore those things in a bit more detail. Here's an example. So let's unpick one relatively straightforward task. So here's a content topic. This could be from geography or a history text, I suppose. And it becomes apparent quite quickly that the language demands for someone who is relatively new to English are really significant in this task. They would need to orient and chronologically sequence the events they're talking about. They will need to use the appropriate grammar terms, grammar structures. So in this case, writing about the past, they'll need to use the correct past tense, the right kind of noun forms, connecting sentences and clauses together, and so on. And of course, they'll need the correct sort of technical vocabulary relating to migration and immigration, as well as more general vocabulary for connecting events. You can see some examples in green there for sort of signposting where people are. This is a lot for someone to take on board, so they're going to need support. And even for learners who are not new to English, the language demands are significant. So whether that is the language of a source they need to read, or in the language of a written response they need to produce. So looking more closely at these language demands, the language demands specifically of a task will help us to move away from only focusing on just subject-specific vocabulary, and to consider the more general academic language that students will need. So here's a breakdown of how you might approach that task, because I appreciate if you're not a language specialist, it can seem a bit daunting to do that. So first, we need to consider the function of the text or the task that we're asking learners to produce. So we have our content, and then this is the function. In this case, to write a historical recount. So we're, in this case, we're recounting historical information. And here we can break down this function into different language demands, and we can look at three distinct areas. Discourse. This is the text level, so the orientation and the chronological sequence of events and the way the text is organized. We can think of it in terms of the sort of sentence level, the syntax, which is just another word for grammar. Things like using the right past tenses, the right kind of connectives. And finally, at the vocabulary level, we're talking about the jargon and also the language that the learners will need around the topic, the more general language. In this case, like lots of time sequencing language will be really useful to them. Okay, so the linguistic terminology here isn't intended to put you off, but rather to draw attention to the different layers of language that we, as proficient English speakers, take for granted, but which learners who are newer to English might need to be explicitly taught. And once armed with an understanding of the language demands, we can start to select the best strategies for the learners. And this brings us to the sort of meat of today's webinar. So let's look at a fairly typical teaching and learning sequence, and how adaptive strategies could be used at each stage of this sequence to gradually build up subject knowledge whilst also helping acquire the linguistic skills needed to reach the final stage, which is independent use or independent practice of the language. Now, we're not advocating trying to do every one of these suggestions that I'm going to go through now. It's just about matching the needs of your learners with the demands of the learning, and also being realistic about what you can achieve given the constraints that you're working under. Obviously, at the moment, a lot of us are working under less than ideal constraints with things like remote learning taking place, or helping learners catch up on missed learning and so on. So some of these strategies are going to be quick wins, but others might take a bit more time to prepare. And where that's the case, we'd always recommend to you that you're choosing strategies that will get you the most value. So only spend time on something if it's something that you're going to be able to reuse and get lots of use out of. Okay, so the first step then is establishing the environment, and in this case, what we're referring to really is two things. One is I think speaks to the teacher and their attitude towards the learner. So having high expectations of learners is one aspect of this we've already talked about. And secondly, creating an environment where multilingualism is viewed as an asset rather than a barrier. Of course, it's necessarily something that happens very quickly. It takes time to build that kind of ethos in your classroom and in your school, but obviously it's really important to persist with. And over time, we need to build a secure environment where learners are happy to use their home languages if they wish to. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with research into translanguaging by people such as Garcia and Lee, who argue that giving plurilingual learners the opportunities to use their full language repertoires will empower them and enable them to reach their full potential. One quick win I think then we can think about in terms of practical terms is simply grouping learners by home language can be useful, where the content is where the focus is on learning new content, because this can allow learners, including those who've got lower language skills, to discuss their understanding of concepts in their first language before having to deal with it in English. Using trios can be useful as well, where it's possible. So, student A might be a Spanish speaker who is newer to English. Student B perhaps also speaks Spanish but is more proficient in English, and student C could be a supportive first language English speaker or a proficient English speaker who will be a good language model and maybe will reduce the pressure on student B as well. If you're going to use a method like this, then always brief the partner to make sure that they understand and that they're willing to take on the role, and so that they understand what is expected of them. For example, it's not their job to do the work of the other child, they're just there to facilitate the communication. And of course, many of you will have learners in your classrooms who don't share language with other learners. Perhaps they're the only learner who speaks their particular language. So in this case, choosing the right English proficient partner will be really important in these situations. And it's nice to sort of build up a little pool of these students to help in these situations. Okay. The next stage then will be to assess knowledge of the field, of the topic. And this will highlight any gaps in conceptual knowledge, and these will need to be addressed, obviously. So in assessing prior knowledge, then, it's important to distinguish between knowledge of the language and knowledge of the subject, as we've discussed. And newly arrived students may bring with them a lot of subject relevant expertise. Much of that learning will be transferable as well. So for example, if the student has an understanding of the impacts of coastal erosion in Sri Lanka or urban growth in Nigeria, that's going to be equally valid when applied to another country. But assessing the prior knowledge of learners who are new to English can be tricky. So it's useful to think about the strategies that we can use to assess that. Sometimes it's possible to have these discussions during initial contact with the school about, we can discuss with them with parents, or if there's someone at the school who can interpret about their prior learning experience. Alternatively, of course, where available, we can use teaching staff and same language speakers. Similarly, grouping learners by home language can be used, for example, with a carousel mind mapping activity. So, if you're starting a topic and you want to get a sense of what your learners in the class already know, then this is a nice activity. So this is where you would have several posters with different topic areas on each poster, and you put your students into different groups, one group for each poster, and the groups move from poster to poster, populating it with their knowledge of the topic, reading the next group's suggestions, then filling in any missing areas. And learners with higher levels of proficiency in English may be able to summarize other points on the posters for those newer to English, and they can add points as well in their first language, as well as in English as well. And ideally they can add translations in English where possible. And this will allow teachers quite quickly to get a sense of what the students know, and it also promotes the learners as the experts in the subject in the eyes of their peers, regardless of their language proficiency as well. And I think this is really important to combat any tendency towards negative bias and assuming that learners who are new to English aren't necessarily able in the subject. And of course, when first language speakers are not available, making use of technology it can be really useful as well to translate short statements about the topic, and then you could do a simple RAG rating, that's red, amber, green, so the students can rate what they know about a particular topic using translated sentences, and that will inform then the kind of content you were using in class or in intervention sessions or homework, which we'll talk more about in a bit. Okay, so here's the sort of real meat here, and we're getting into the practical things of how we actually build the students' knowledge base and develop their language at the same time. So the key term, as I think I mentioned earlier here, is the idea of message abundancy. This comes from the book Scaffolding Language, Scaffolding Learning by Pauline Gibbons. And message abundancy simply refers to presenting key ideas in multiple ways in order to immerse students in both the subject learning and the language. And this is including learners who are new to English and classroom activities can be difficult, but by providing multiple opportunities to engage with and revisit the key learning, we're going to increase the chances of learners being actively involved. So for example, you might use a glossary of terms and definitions, maybe with some translations. You can have video with captions enabled. There could be teacher-led discussions. There could be graphic organizers showing the relationship between key ideas and labeled diagrams, all of which would lead up to the reading of a text about a topic. And I'm sure you would sprinkle in these kind of strategies in your own teaching, but it's really important to understand why it's really useful to do this. It's not just to keep it interesting. It's really important to give learners access to the language. Pre-teaching is another important part here. Some learners are going to benefit from having a head start before the topic begins. So we can provide things like vocabulary lists or a research piece in their home language. For example, they could go and research natural hazards in their home country if we're talking about environmental hazards in a geography context. If learners are going into the topic with a clear idea of some of the concepts in their home language, then the learning in the lessons, even if it's in English, is going to be much easier. It also is going to be really useful if a learner has missed some important learning, and obviously that's particularly important at the moment where we're finding students have missed learning due to the pandemic. For example, if they haven't yet learned about the long profile of a river, but an upcoming unit might be on the formation of waterfalls, then you can cover that with a sort of pre-task. Some schools have curriculum-related intervention sessions, which also might be a good time to fill in this kind of missed learning and pre-teach key concepts. And of course, families can be a really important resource. Families will bring with them their own experiences of, history, geography, and religion. But I think the key message here is to ensure that families are comfortable with the idea that using home languages is really fine and important, in fact. So they don't need to rely on English, especially obviously if they're not fluent speakers of the language. So developing home language skills alongside English is going to strengthen additional language acquisition, not weaken it, even if that might seem counterintuitive to them. So definitely discourage sort of things like English only policies at home, where that wouldn't be the normal languaging practice. Okay. So as I'm sure many of you are aware already, translation tools are getting increasingly sophisticated and easy to use, and could be, again, a really effective tool here. It's worth having them, these two tools downloaded on any class iPads, for example, and to expect students, and you also ask students to download it to their own devices so that they know how to use them effectively and encouraging that kind of independent learning. So we've got apps such as Say Hi and Google Translate here. I'm sure you probably have your own apps that might work for the languages in the context that you're working in, and please add any suggestions that you've got in the chat. And the good things here is that students can speak or type, and it will be translated in both a written and a spoken form. And apps which provide spoken translations are particularly useful where learners might have limited literacy in their first language, for example. And they can translate so quickly now that they can allow for an almost instant translation of conversations, albeit with inaccuracies. Google Translate also has a very useful functionality, which is that it's possible to hover a camera over a text to get an instant translation. And obviously, this is useful for short sections of text. And the scanning function in particular is really helpful, and that allows you to use the camera to scan a text, which is then translated virtually instantly. And this is obviously particularly useful perhaps if the class is using a textbook, where you've got learners who are struggling to access the text. Okay. Use of home languages as well, and home language resources are useful. I mean, here's a couple of websites that you can use, for example, which contain videos in different languages or with subtitles in different languages that you can use as part of flipped learning. Khan Academy is one. It provides lessons and lectures on lots of different topics and is available in a number of languages. A learner can sign up, and then they just need to set the language, and then the learning content will be available in that language. TED, of course, as well. TED.com, TED Talks has got hundreds of talks on a range of academic subjects, many of which relate to school topics, and there are transcripts and subtitles available for these talks in dozens of different languages. I'm sure you know as well, YouTube does have an open transcript function which auto creates a transcript, but it is very error prone and will need a lot of editing if you're going to use it with students. So I would advise caution with YouTube videos unless you've got the time to edit the transcripts. And online monolingual dictionaries such as the Free Dictionary and other first language websites can enable learners to research a topic in their home language. Immersive Reader in the home language will support learners with limited first language literacy too. So, I think dual language topic word lists, which can be available from a variety of different sources online. In the UK, there's the Hounslow Language Service, and EAL Highland is another option. And the translation facility in Google Sheets, which is actually becoming quite efficient and quite reliable now, is really helpful as well. And if you look online, people often share their templates, so it allows you to just populate a spreadsheet with English terms, and it will automatically then translate those into different languages, which is obviously very useful if you've got a multilingual class. It's worth having a look because people often upload ones, as I've said. I think there's an example here of a really good one that somebody has created, the EAL 2.0 dictionary. But actually creating your own can be quite quick and easy, and it also means that you can adapt it to suit your own learners. I think including translations of concepts as well as keywords is really important, and any glossaries or knowledge organizers can act as a reference aid for content as well as language. The other advantage with creating your own is that you can choose the wording of the definition as well, so that you can avoid any confusion. For example, dictionaries will tend to give you a generic definition, where in a subject-specific topic there might be a more subject-specific definition that's more appropriate. So, for example, the dictionary definition of abrasion is much more broad than the specific definition of that word in geography when we're using it to talk about rivers or rock formations or something like that. Students might be in a position then also to share these glossaries at home and be able to talk through the concepts in their first language. So they're very, really, really rich tool that can be used. That's the example of the Google Sheets one that I'm just showing you there. Obviously, strategies for teaching new vocabulary, especially the academic language needed at secondary level, are very well documented. So we're not going to go into massive detail here, but I think that the big difference for teaching academic vocabulary with plurilingual learners is to make really good use of the other languages that the learners speak. And a good sort of checklist for teaching vocabulary is as follows. Providing context is key. So not just teaching terms in isolation, but teaching it in terms of chunks of language is always going to be better for the learners. Making sure that learners record their new language, and explicitly discussing things like word classes and spelling patterns with the learners is going to raise their awareness as well of language use, particularly important in English, where spelling is often quite inconsistent, which may not be the case for learners' first languages. Freya diagrams are another good way of recording vocabulary so that learners can return to it for clarification and revision. So here's an example with the word erode. You can see here the basic structure can easily be adapted to include the learner's first language. We can see in this example there's a first language box. There's a box where we're using it in context in a sentence, and there are examples where they can record words in the same family. So erode also relates to erosion, and then they can include common terms that appear that are related to the word as well. Some schools will use these kind of diagrams as part of knowledge organizer homeworks, where the focus is on developing academic vocabulary. It can work really effectively. Okay, for plurilingual learners, it's also worth remembering the importance of ensuring that the link between the meaning and receptive language is clear, so that when a learner sees or hears the words, they will associate that form with the correct meaning. And this also means that learners need opportunities to practice producing the language, particularly where there is a bigger distance between their home language and English. So, for example, glance back at the topic of translations. The translation spreadsheet can show that some languages, especially those that have got Latin roots, for example, will tend to have more similarities with English than a language without Latin roots, such as Chinese or Arabic. But of course, it's going to be really important to draw students' attention to spellings if they do speak a language that has similarities with English, because the spellings are likely to be different and the pronunciations are likely to be different as well. So you might want to focus them on those. And this is why knowing the languages your students speak is really going to be helpful in terms of understanding how difficult they might find the new language. It seems fairly obvious, but it's important to state that learners who speak languages which share fewer similarities to English are going to need more opportunities to experience and practice new language, because they've got less to sort of hook their new learning on. So it does take longer if you're working with students from a more distant language like Chinese, for example. We've introduced the new language, and then we also want to reinforce and give students the opportunities to practice and experience the language in different ways, give them more exposure. And games, I think, are a particularly effective way for doing this. I'm sure you all have your own favorites, and feel free to add them in the chat if you want, but I'm just going to talk through a couple that I find particularly useful. One of these are the sort of loop card games, in which the learners are given at least one card before the game starts. Learners need to look at the term on the left and then decide what the definition for that is, and then they look at the definition on the right, and they have to work out what term that refers to, which will be on a different card that someone else holds. Then once the game starts, a student reads out the definition on the right of one of their cards. The rest of the class listens, and they have to see if the definition is written on their card. And if it is, then they shout out the correct term, and then they read out the next definition and so on, and the game continues until the loop is complete and we're back to the term on the first card. This example here has got images, you can see, to support the meaning, but as students get more confident, you can obviously remove the images. And it's a really nice game with the whole class, and it can be used really well as a starter or as a kind of plenary to review what you've learned. It's also good because it enables you to sort of place learners who are less proficient in English further down the chain, so that they get to hear the language modeled several times before they have to speak. And you can also, it's also easy to initially select the more accessible terms and give those to the students who need the most language support. And you can do that very easily by just putting coloured dots on the back of certain cards, so that either to indicate that they're, perhaps lower proficiency or better for higher proficiency students, and then you can give them to the appropriate learners in your class. Bingo is another really popular and useful one that can be adapted in a similar way, providing pictures or written or spoken forms depending on the skills that need to be practiced. I think a good variation that I've used with higher level learners is kind of text bingo. And you can use this as a kind of predictive activity where you tell the students they're going to hear a text about a topic, and then you can give them a blank bingo card with 4 to 6 spaces, and they populate the card with the words they think they're going to hear connected with the topic. Then they listen to the text, and then they can mark their own cards and to see how many they guessed. It could work well as a kind of predictive task or as a way of sort of reviewing knowledge that have already been taught. Here's some examples of these cards for the loop game. Okay, and I believe you can download that from the website, that particular task, if you're interested in, if you're a geography teacher. Another really useful activity is this quiz trade game, which is really nice. It's really nice for a way to reinforce meaning and practice reading, listening, and speaking all together. So ideally, this would be a sort of mingle activity where students are walking around the class, but obviously you can adapt it to suit your classroom setting. So in this case, cards with terms and definitions are distributed to the group, and the students familiarize themselves with their own card. And then student A quizzes their partner first, asking what the term means. And they can then ask follow-up questions with prompts to support if necessary to elicit more information. And then once student B gets it right, they in turn quiz student A with the term on their card. And that's the second quiz. So it's quiz. And then if they get both terms correct, then they swap cards and they move on to speak to the new students. So they trade their cards and go to speak to someone else. And so again, this means they get the chance to read, hear, and talk about the terminology they're learning. And again, I'm sure you've got your own sort of favorites for reviewing this kind of vocabulary. Games like Backs to the Board are really effective with competitive groups, I found. That's where students have to define a word without using that term to their teammates, and the teammates have to guess what it is. This surely isn't anything new to you, but I think it illustrates how adding an EAL lens to classroom activities can shed light on ways to adapt them to increase the learners' opportunities to use language. So collaborative communication games provide these kind of opportunities for developing subject knowledge, but also for using language, and especially repeating language, which is really important to embed it. So an example here then is a barrier game, and this is taken from a folder on using the Black Death in Europe. Not the most cheerful topic, especially in the moment, but in this example then learner A has map A, learner B has map B, and without looking at each other's maps, each student has to complete the information. In this case, the information they're missing are the dates or the timings of that are involved, and so they have to ask their partner questions. Providing a simple speaking frame for this, as I've just shown on the screen, will ensure that the learners who are newer to English can access the activity. Those that are more fluent just don't need to have the frame. And as you can see, the content focus of this task is to find out the factual information about the spread of the plague. But the language focus here is on using dates correctly, which obviously is a really important thing in the study of history and other subjects too. So this is a nice way of consolidating that aspect of language in this activity. Okay. I'm just going to briefly draw your attention to some of the other types of activities that are available on our website. The information gap activities can also be very helpful. You can see more on our Great Ideas pages online. But let's move on now to the next stage. We've talked about building knowledge, and now we're going to consider adapting, modeling, and scaffolding strategies so that they can be used when learners are nearly ready for writing. Okay. For example, learners might have an excellent understanding of topic-specific jargon, what we call Tier 3 language, but they may still need support with the language needed to demonstrate that learning. So using modeling, explanations, and scaffolds as the building blocks to develop the skills to tackle a demanding text or a new style of writing is really going to reduce the cognitive workload and allow these learners to lay solid foundations to their learning. So yeah, let's look at ways we can scaffold and make learners more independent. When we're building knowledge of the field, we tend to focus on what's called Tier 3 vocabulary. That's the kind of subject-specific vocabulary, but it's also important to remember Tier 2 vocabulary. That's the language that occurs in academic situations, but is used across different contexts. It's not just specific to one context. We know that learners will tend to develop their social language first and feel more confident with that, and then they're going to move across to using more academic language, hopefully as they progress in their school career. But this transition doesn't happen by magic. You know, we need to plan for it, and using academic language needs to be deliberately taught. But I think it's also really important to remember that building learners' confidence with social language is something we can make good use of, and we need to support them to do. In fact, I would argue that social language is actually the way that learners and teachers construct meaning during lessons. Okay, we don't sit there and talk like we're an academic encyclopedia when we're in a lesson. We use kind of relatively informal social language to construct and build meaning with learners in the classroom. So they need opportunities and help to develop that side as well as the academic side as well. And we need to bridge the gap between those two areas. Simple strategies are, using the teacher as a language model. So a student might make a statement, Allah made the angels, and the teacher can recast that using more academic language. Setting these high expectations about language use is really important, and it's about encouraging learners to take risks and pushing them. Again, things like word banks will support this this kind of development. In this example, we can see how the teacher has recast the more typically social language that the learner is confident with, such as people and things, into more academic language. Archaeologists study artifacts. And they have elicited more academic language by linking it to a more familiar context. And finally, they have modeled a useful grammatical structure that's typical of explanations, in order to do. So you can see this process of recasting, eliciting, and modeling is a really nice way of scaffolding language in a very low preparation way. Here's an example of why English can be quite confusing to an English learner. Let's take the word volume, and we can see it used in all these different contexts. But of course, the meaning of the word is going to alter according to the subject or context in which we are teaching it. So by teaching vocabulary in context and teaching it in chunks rather than dealing with each word individually, we're going to give learners more of a hook on which to attach the meaning of the word. Okay. Probably the most difficult skill is supporting learners to reach the point where they are confident in writing a good response independently, and in particular thinking about responses to exam questions. So many teachers will deconstruct sample responses, looking at the mark scheme and thinking about how the response meets the criteria. So continue doing that, but we also need to add in an extra layer of language use to that deconstruction. So that it's going to help students link the criteria to the language that they need to fulfill that criteria. So by selecting text which exemplify key structures, teachers can explicitly teach the language needed to fulfill those requirements. So here's all the sort of language that the students might need. As with all strategies, this is going to work best if it's practiced as part of a regular routine, rather than just being, hurriedly sort of added on in the run-up to exams. It's something we need to be thinking about, right from the start of term, getting students used to linking the language to the types of responses we want them to use. Okay. And the same is true when teachers are modeling any kind of good model of language. It might be you're modeling how to write a good response, or you're sharing a student's work with the class. Simply talking through the language choices and the observations about language patterns, or eliciting reasons for choices from the students, can really be a really powerful way to provide explicit language teaching to equip learners to understand what they need to do. And you don't need to be a language expert to do this, to ask, oh, so why did you choose this word, or why did you why did you do this? You're eliciting that from the students themselves and just drawing their attention and raising awareness. Okay, so I appreciate we're getting towards the end now, and the penultimate stage in this learning cycle then is it's providing some kind of guided practice. So this is extending the modeling stage and allowing the students to try it for themselves. And this is sort of obviously the first step towards constructing their own written text independently. And strategies such as shared writing to model a text, and using sentence stems, starters, and writing frames are really helpful here. But we've covered these in more detail in other webinars that we've done, so I would encourage you to go and have a look at those. But one effective strategy that we can, which is really useful for explicitly guiding learners in their language development, is the dictogloss, which I'm going to talk about in this slide here. So here's an example of planning for the language demands of an exam question. And here are some strategies that have been suggested to meet the language demands at word, sentence, and discourse levels. And so the dictogloss is a really good way of kind of bringing these things all together. We can use a model response to an exam question as a dictogloss. So in the dictogloss, what you might do is explicitly guide learners in responding to longer exam questions. So first of all, what you might do is ask the students to listen to the teacher read out a sample exam response. And then you're going to ask them to collaboratively construct the response themselves before comparing it to a modeled example. So there's an intense focus on language here, which makes it a great technique for questions that expect relatively predictable responses or specific grammatical structures, so that the learning can be readily transferred to other types of questions. In the slide shown here, the coloured strips provide the instructions for each stage of the activity. So you can see those there. And again, you can adapt this very easily according to the language proficiency of your group, with higher. It also works well by, it's a really nice activity for mixing, having mixed groups of different language proficiencies, because they'll be able to kind of support each other to build the text. Okay. So in this example, then we want students to be able to add details about the specific locations in the stages of development of a waterfall. And so a useful structure is using relative pronouns to introduce a new clause. So using things like where, or that, and so on, to link to clauses. So providing you're clear about the structure you're teaching, you don't really need to have a PowerPoint slide to show this. But the final stages involve students constructing and editing their own versions and paying close attention to the grammatical structure that has been taught before finally being given the original version to compare their response with. So you can see the procedure for this one here, which is slightly different. Working on your own, using your notes to write up the response, then work in pairs to read the sample response and make any changes, highlight to where relative pronouns have been used, and looking to see if there are any other grammatical instructions. Okay. Substitutions and writing frames I've already mentioned are really helpful to reduce cognitive workload and supporting learners in producing languages, and really effective for practicing small chunks of writing. And again, really adaptable for different proficiency levels. Again, we haven't got time to go into detail here. We have got a webinar specifically on substitution tables if anyone's interested, and you can find that on the Bell Foundation YouTube page. But you can see how we can use it really helpfully here to provide a lot of a very productive set of language options. In this case, it's reinforcing a particular structure, which is the comparative structure. Okay, so the final part then is the independent practice stage, and I realize we're coming to the end of our time. The important point to make there really is just to bring this back to what we talked about at the start, which is the idea of having high expectations of our learners, regardless of their proficiency in English. And knowing that we need to provide the correct type, level, and amount of support. So eventually, with sufficient practice, with the right types of scaffolding, learners will need less and less support until gradually they're confident about using the language independently, and gradually removing the scaffolding and placing greater emphasis on peer reviews and then self-monitoring is going to support learners in moving towards greater independence in their ability. And this obviously goes for all subjects, but I think it's particularly relevant to humanities. Learners need to be fully prepared for independent practice, and they need to experience success in it. And where learners are confused about any aspect of their learning, the scaffolding can be reintroduced to provide further practice. Okay, and I think that's basically, we're almost done. The final point is just to speak to, with the vast amounts of knowledge that gets tested in exams, strategies for regularly reviewing prior learning are really important. So I'm sure again you've all experienced and heard about retrieval and interleaving, but just this goes for language too. Keep recycling and reintroducing language that you've used and introduced so that students can get the most opportunities that they can to experience those. And finally, just a nod to our Great Ideas pages, which I think we've already provided lots of links to, where there's more guidance on many of the strategies we've discussed today. And I think all that remains for me to say is thank you very much for attending. I don't know if we've got any time for questions, but thank you for joining, and I hope some of it was useful. Caroline, over to you. Are there any questions? You're on mute, Caroline. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. No. No, there haven't been any questions in the chat box, Tom. Thanks for your presentation. I thought it was really, really useful.
Yeah,
And
that is a
an
lot to take in.
awful
Alan's
lot
just
to
commented.
take in, definitely.
I agree.
Matthew, I've seen your
Don't worry.
comment, and I'll try to. It could be something to do with needing to register. I don't know. I'll find out why you can't access that and I'll try and get back to you. Thank you very much for attending. I hope it was useful. And I just wanted to remind you that you will get a recording of the webinar tomorrow, together with the links and a link to a survey for the webinar. This webinar was based on an article that was in SecEd, so I've just posted a link to that as well. This is the last webinar for this year, but if you keep checking the website, the next year's webinars are already being advertised, and the courses are all advertised already. So we really look forward to seeing you in 2022.